Welcome, everyone, to All Things Breastfeeding. I'm Barbara Robertson, the host of your podcast. And All Things Breastfeeding, we're bringing you happenings in the breastfeeding world and just want to share information as it comes out. And I am joined by my LactaLearning co-founder, Nancy Mohrbacher. Hello, Nancy.
Hey, Barbara.
All right, well, today we're going to be talking about using research in our clinical practice. We've had a couple of things recently that we've been reporting on because when the research comes out, we feel like that's our job to share it with people.
Mhm.
But it's not always clear what it means. Should it change our clinical practice? Should it not? And so let's first start out by talking about our role with research studies, because not all of us know what to do with a research study. So, when you think about a research study, what are the things you look at for, Nancy, in a study to help you kind of decide how important it is, that kind of thing? So, just a quick couple of things that you think about.
Well, one of the things I look at is who did the study, because sometimes I'm familiar with the person and I respect their work. And if it's someone like that who's done the study, then that makes a difference. I look at where the study is published. I
What
look at,
journal? Hmm.
right, what journal. I look at, what type of study is it? For example, I would obviously take a randomized control trial or a systematic review more seriously than expert opinion or just case studies or case series.
Hmm.
So those are some of the things.
Right, a meta-analysis or a literature review versus a case study of one, although that case study could be very important.
Mhm.
How many people, how many participants were in the study,
Right.
and again, we are not necessarily research experts and we don't necessarily have to be. Um, but, research is a big part of our life
Mhm.
and we're coming up with more and more studies all the time. And it's like, well, what do we do with them once we read them or we hear about them? Does our clinical practice change? Does it not?
Yeah, can I mention something about my own personal experience in the field?
Yeah.
So when I first started, I've been in lactation for more than 40 years now. And when I first started, it was a brand new field. When I started as a peer supporter, there wasn't even a lactation field at that time. It took a few
Right.
years for the IBCLCs to come into being. But oftentimes during those early years, what would happen is we'd meet somebody who was maybe a little more experienced than we were, and they would say something and we would latch onto it like, oh, well, this is what I need to do. And then we would just change our practice. So, we
Hmm.
were using expert opinion a lot. And what I've learned over the years is that expert opinion isn't always the most reliable source.
Yeah, absolutely. And things have changed. We didn't have any research at all really back in the day. We had a little bit, but it
We
was
had
more
research,
related, you know.
but
Yeah.
it was not the kind of research that would necessarily change our clinical practice. It was like, how important is breastfeeding to the health of
Yes.
mothers and babies?
Yes. Which we knew already, but now we've proven it with research. And so, you and I are working on Breastfeeding Answers third edition, and literally for a chapter, there's somewhere between 400 and 1,000 studies for one
Oh,
chapter.
a lot.
So, there's a lot more research that's coming out, and it can make it tricky. And
Mhm.
so the question I think is, can one study change your practice? And you have an example, and I have an example of where it's like, yeah, maybe. So talk about your example, Nancy.
All right. So in 2009, I was on one of our lactation listservs, and there was a post that appeared with a link to a study. And I clicked on the link, and it was like my head exploded. I
Mm.
mean, it completely changed everything that I thought about the most basic aspect of my practice. It was a link to a study that was done by Suzanne Colson, a research midwife from the UK, in which she was looking at the impact of positioning on babies' ability to breastfeed.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, I realized, oh my gosh, we've been making breastfeeding harder for new
Yeah.
mothers and babies and other nursing parents than it needs to be. And so I began, experimenting with what I learned from that study with individual, nursing couples. And I discovered that yes, indeed, that, having the mother lean back, having the baby on top, letting the baby be the one who self-attaches solved a multitude of problems. And so that was an example of a study that completely changed my practice and even my focus in lactation. I've been like passionate about that ever since.
Right, this is where the starter position came from you
Right.
and all of that. And I think the difference right there is that you weren't going to hurt anyone,
No, no.
right? You were just playing around with latching and positioning
Yeah.
and it wasn't going to cause any harm. First, harm is really our mantra.
Right.
And
There were no ethical problems in trying different positions.
exactly, exactly. And then I had an expert opinion because I read your article, The Magic Number, and again, my head was like, okay, this may what I've been seeing in my practice, which is that if people add more milk removals, if they're struggling with supply, their supply goes up.
Yeah,
And
and
it's
these are people who were expressing milk, either
exactly. These are people who
exclusively
are
or
expressing,
primarily.
right?
Yeah.
Especially my family's going back, we're working and breastfeeding.
Right.
And so it really confirmed to me that what I had been seeing, which was that we have an increase but you laid it out in a way that was like, oh, if most people drop below seven-ish milk removals in 24 hours, their supply often goes back down, which is why adding another milk removal helped because I was increasing the milk removals. And it just made it all make sense to me.
And that was not a study, but it reflected the research that I'd been reading.
Exactly. And so then I was able to implement that in my practice. And so one of the questions I would ask is how many times a day
Uh-huh.
per 24 hours are you removing the milk?
Right.
And either by nursing, hand expressing, or pumping. And it's just like, oh, it just made it all like make sense and really reinforce what I've been seeing. So those are examples of where things, and it's not going to hurt anyone again,
Right. Right.
you
There's no
know,
ethical problems with increasing the number
no
of.
ethical, right, exactly. So now let's get into some more controversial things. So flange fitting or breast shield fitting, for a long time we had very little research on it.
Mhm.
And the research we had seemed to imply that using a larger shield was better. And now we have new research that's coming out. We had one study that showed that maybe using a smaller shield was the way to go. And now we,
I would maybe describe it differently. I would say that we had an approach to fitting previously in which we were looking for space around the nipple, and have, a little bit of the areola being drawn in. And now the new idea, which we just have preliminary research on, is that the nipple should actually be touching the sides of the nipple tunnel, which leads to much smaller flanges being used.
yeah, I never quite looked at it that way. I
Mhm.
always looked at it like you might need a bigger size. That's what the
Mhm.
research said to me because I've always tried the shields with parents. That
Right.
was
And
my bottom line.
I did that as well, but that's what I was looking for. And it
Hmm.
was possible. And many parents, I did actually have them go smaller because too much of the areola was being drawn in. But in those days, and even, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, we didn't have sizes that
Yeah.
were as small as what we're going for today.
Yeah. Again, I actually didn't, how it looked didn't matter to me. It was how did it feel and how much milk were you getting? That was
Right. And
always the way I did it. And
and
so
too much,
now,
I was going to say
yeah,
too much areola usually is uncomfortable. So
not for
that,
everybody, Nancy, not for everyone.
okay.
And so now then we have research that says maybe smaller shields, and now we have other research that says maybe shield fitting isn't as important. And so I think with the important note here is we're not asking anybody just because we've shared the research that maybe shield fitting isn't as important as we thought. We're not
Mhm.
saying stop fitting shields for shields.
No, no,
We're
that's not,
saying, yeah, we're not saying that at all because
no.
we don't have enough research to imply that we need to change that practice.
I
What I
think we,
think,
we both believe that fitting
ah,
shields is important. The question is,
exactly.
is how we fit them,
Right.
and what actually gives the best results for the most people.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we're looking for. And that's where it's still not entirely clear. We have a couple of theories now. But I think Nancy and I both believe bottom line is try lots of sizes with families up or down until they find what feels comfortable to them and they get milk. And so this is an example of we don't need to say, oh no, let's not fit for breast shields,
Right,
even though there have been a couple of studies that imply that maybe shield fitting isn't as important as we thought.
right.
So
And
we
I,
have to be careful with that.
and I think ultimately what's going to happen, this is my opinion from looking at a lot of similar types of issues, is
Mhm.
probably what we're going to find is that maybe like half the mothers, maybe flange fitting isn't as important as we thought, but for the other half, it may be crucial. So it's
Exactly.
probably not going to be an across the board thing.
So we have to wait. We have to wait. But I think that still, trusting our parents to tell us what feels comfortable for them and what helps them get milk.
And always, when we are focused in on an individual person, the idea is always to figure out what's going to work
Mhm.
best for that person, whatever it may be. And it sometimes people are exceptions to the rules, so you just never
Always. There's always outliers.
yes,
In
always.
every research study, there are outliers who
Right.
don't fit into the study or the study results.
Correct.
And
Correct.
so we have to keep our eyes out for that. And yeah, so another example of something that we're getting more research on is tongue ties.
Mhm.
And we just were looking at the, next section of the book on tongue ties.
Mhm.
And, we went from where we weren't releasing very many ties at all to now we're releasing lots and lots of ties, which is
Right.
concerning because it is a surgery, even though it's a minor surgery for most people.
Mhm.
But it is a surgery.
Right.
And it's expensive. There's a lot of money to be made, which is always nerve-wracking. And
Right.
so, Nancy, what are a couple of things that we found when we were looking at the research on tongue ties, the latest stuff?
Well, we did when we did our tongue tie update 2026.
Right. So check that out if you want more details.
Yeah, and that was
It's
the
going to be
study that
quick.
was done in India in a place where they don't revise tongue ties, but where breastfeeding is the cultural norm. And they really discovered there wasn't much of a difference in breastfeeding outcomes in a culture like that
Mhm.
when babies are tongue tied.
Yep.
That they seem to do very well with breastfeeding, in spite of that. So that was interesting because I think, we obviously don't live in a culture like that.
Right.
So you can't necessarily draw conclusions for what's right here.
Mhm.
But another study that we looked at was one in which a clinic who had a multidisciplinary approach. They had ear, nose, and throat doctors, ENTs who would perform tongue ties, and they also had speech and language pathologists on staff. And so what they decided, they had previously just basically, whenever a baby was referred to them for a tongue tie release, they would just perform it. But they decided to do a study in which they had the babies first see the speech and language pathologist and try to determine if there was some other underlying issue before they did the tongue tie release. And they found that in 62% of the cases, the tongue tie releases were not necessary because the speech and language pathologist were able to like adjust positioning and latch. They were able to discover the baby maybe had reflux disease that needed to be
Mhm.
treated. The babies were sleepy and they figured out how to stimulate them so they could nurse more actively. So there was like any number of issues that they were able to solve without a frenotomy. So
Mhm.
that was a really interesting one for me. And I think you and I both know Catherine Watson Jenna, who shared
Mhm.
with us that she was doing a study, an ultrasound study in New York, and had the lactation consultants referring babies who were tongue tied to them for the ultrasound study. And she discovered that half of those babies actually did not have tongue ties.
Right.
So I think, those kinds of studies really kind of make you think.
Right. And so again, we don't live because another factor with the babies that weren't treated is it was a breastfeeding cultural norm, but also they had good lactation support. And
Right,
so,
from family and providers.
right, and we have neither of those things here in the
Right,
US.
right. So different situation.
Yeah, so and it's hard because we also don't always have a place if we see a baby struggling with latching or a parent struggling with pain,
Right.
we don't always have a place to go, a center where there's a multidisciplinary thing.
Right.
And so I think that we end up releasing a lot of babies because we don't know what else to do.
Yeah. I think that can happen. That obviously
Yeah.
does happen in a lot of
Right.
places.
And we're not saying because some babies it seems to be critical
Yeah.
here in the United
Right.
States anyway.
Right. Right.
And so that again, we're not saying, and so this is again the clinical practice. What does
Right.
the research indicate for us to do with our clinical practice?
Right.
And the answer I think here is be more conservative.
Right.
Let's just make sure that we're doing our best job with
Right.
latching and positioning and the things that are in our scope.
Yeah, because in another study, they found this was a place that just did the releases when the babies were referred, and they found 50% of the babies did not improve with breastfeeding afterwards.
And I
And
think we've all seen this.
yeah, so
And we're like
it's
scratching our heads, like, huh.
right. So I've spoken in New Zealand also a year ago, and that's a place where they actually worked really hard on this because they were discovering that so many tongue ties were being diagnosed by the doctors there, and so they got up to an 11% tongue tie release rate, and
Hmm.
they decided that wait a minute, this is just the research does not support that this is how many babies need a tongue tie release. So they worked really hard at this multidisciplinary approach, and they were able to get their tongue tie release rate down to about 3%
Hmm.
of the babies. And what was most important here is that the breastfeeding outcomes were the same in the babies who had the release done and did not have the release done. So
Hmm.
what that meant was they were clearly able to get to whatever the underlying causes were and address those rather than sending babies for frenotomy who didn't benefit from it.
Right. And so clinically, the implications are some babies appear to need a release, some
Yeah.
babies do not. And
Mhm.
so what do we do? And I think again, just making sure we're doing our due diligence and
Right.
then having folks to refer to
Right.
when we're
Right.
not sure
Right.
what's happening.
Right. And like when I did a presentation on tongue type for a group in Poland last year, basically what the recommendations were that I found that made a lot of sense to me was the first step is to get basic lactation care because in a lot of cases, just adjusting, how the baby's breastfeeding makes a huge difference. But if for example, we're in the situation where we're unable to make an improvement by
Mhm.
giving basic lactation care, then the next step was not a frenotomy, but rather to a speech and language pathologist or
Yeah.
to some sort of feeding specialist. So
Mhm.
I think actually, if that actually makes a lot of sense to me, and then that person works on maybe some of the other potential underlying causes, and then, if necessary, the baby goes for a frenotomy.
Yeah. And of course, there's some things that we're in a hurry. Parents are going to maybe stop
Right.
breastfeeding, and
Yes.
so there's always, again, those outliers,
Right.
but just being a little more conservative is my take-home clinical implication
Yeah.
with this and making sure I'm doing my best job. Well, there
Yeah.
was another study that came out recently, and we'll have a link to it in our show notes. It's leftover infant milk after bottle feeding, parental practices, and microbiological findings.
Mhm.
And this was just released recently, 2026.
Mhm.
And basically, they wanted to determine if the financial, emotional time burden associated with bottle feeding and parental milk disposal practices, they wanted to understand the connection between those two. And then they actually wanted to look at bacterial growth and leftover human milk and formula under
Mhm.
different storage conditions.
Mhm.
So, of course, this is very interesting,
Mhm.
clinically,
Mhm.
because I think many of us worry, gosh, are we throwing away milk we don't need to throw away?
Right.
And so it's like, oh, so I already have a bias myself, a confirmation, I'm looking for
Yes.
confirmation,
Yes.
right? And so they did a cross-sectional online survey, and what they found, which is really, this is tragic, is 46% of the people discarded leftover milk daily.
Mhm.
We're like, oh my God, we don't want to be
Oh,
throwing
yeah.
away the work.
That's a lot.
And then 84% of those said that they would not do that if they knew it was safe.
Uh-huh.
So here we are, we're like, okay, okay. And what they did was they looked at this milk and they discovered in their study with 44 babies, right?
Uh-huh.
So, small study that
Hmm.
the bacterial burden in leftover infant milk remained stable below concerning thresholds for 8 hours when refrigerated, 4 to 8 hours at room temperature.
And what about the formula? What did they find out about that?
Oh, they had the formula actually showed similar stability. But it's
Uh,
funny because again, my bias, I'm like, I don't care about the formula.
I was
Because
just curious.
yeah, now I know. It really significant bacteria growth occurred only after 24 hours
Hmm.
and at 20 degrees Celsius, which
Hmm.
I'm not sure exactly. It's like 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Um, and so, and so we're like, oh, but it's one study,
Right.
44 babies. I think we could say that a lot of people are throwing away milk. That seems pretty solid conclusion.
Yeah.
But what do we do with this now, Nancy? Because a lot of people are like me with that bias.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, oh, I can share with families that
Right.
they don't have to throw away their milk. What do
Yeah.
I do?
Well, there's drawbacks to doing that because,
Yeah,
I mean, as you say, you and I are not research experts. We read a
no.
lot of research, but the idea behind the guidelines is the people who are research experts are the ones who are evaluating, is this study solid enough to
Hmm.
give this out as information for parents?
Right.
I read a study some years ago that was looked at new parents and the advice they were given about specifically milk storage.
Hmm.
And what they discovered was that when they were given information like, well, maybe it's good for this length of time, and maybe people shared research with them and it was sort of uncertain, it wasn't cut and dried.
Hmm.
Many of those families actually stopped breastfeeding because
Hmm.
they felt so uneasy with the idea that nobody could tell them for sure how long their milk was good.
Hmm.
And so I think we have to be aware of that, you know, to we have current guidelines which I believe say the CDC says you can save leftover milk for 2 hours
Hmm.
after feeding it by bottle express milk. um, a lot of families are just more comfortable with very specific guidelines. So
Right.
this idea that we could maybe save them from getting rid of milk, I think we need to be aware that for some families, they're so, worried about, doing the wrong thing when it comes to their expressed milk that might actually dissuade them from
Right.
continuing on. And so, my feeling is that in this case, what we want to do is we want to see what the research experts have to say about this, or even better, probably they're going to say we need to replicate this with larger numbers,
Hmm.
and then eventually perhaps the guidelines will change. I know there was some years ago when I was working on the last edition of Breastfeeding Answers, there were studies about milk that had been frozen and then there was a power outage. And was it safe to refreeze it? And what it looked like from the research was that actually it was okay to refreeze it, but that wasn't what the guidelines said. And so at the time, I wrote a series of questions. These are the things to ask if you're in this situation. But this time, I see that now actually the guidelines are, as long as there's crystals still left in the milk, frozen crystals, it's okay to refreeze it. So now we don't have to go through that process anymore. So some of it is just giving these studies time to play out and maybe get replicated, and wait for the guidelines to change. I don't know that we really are doing families a great service by being a little more loosey goosey and saying, oh, maybe it is good. I'm not sure we're doing them favors if we do that.
Well, they say it takes 17 to 18 years, something like that, for research to turn into practice. And so we're
That's
way
an
ahead of the
average.
game. We're
That's an
like,
average.
we're
Yeah.
talking months
Yeah.
that these
Yeah.
studies are coming out. And yeah, I think that what we know, the guidelines know that that's what the safe way to handle milk is.
Right.
This is
Right.
a theory
Right.
that says maybe this guy, it could be longer, but it's 44 babies and it's a theory at this point.
Right.
And so
Right.
we need to just be careful that
That's
we
not
don't jump on bandwagons.
that is not the quality of research that we need to change guidelines for everyone.
Right. It's just not enough people. It's not enough babies. So
Yeah.
yeah, if they could replicate it with more milk,
Right.
then I
Right.
think we're really talking. But it's
Mhm.
exciting to think about maybe our milk guidelines could expand in the future, but we're not there
Right.
yet.
Right. That's correct.
Yeah. So we just want to be careful because, as we said, sometimes there are studies or clinical, I'm sorry, expert opinion where we can be like, oh, again, if it's not going to do any harm,
Right.
we can play around with it. But other things, sometimes we just have to wait and see
Yeah.
how it's all going to shake out.
Yep.
So, thank you, Nancy. Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, when we're trying to, again, share research, doesn't mean we always have to just immediately change our clinical practice. As a matter of fact, many times that wouldn't be appropriate.
Correct.
But there
Correct.
are times when it's like, yeah, we could play around with some of the ideas.
Yes. Correct.
All right. Well, Nancy, you certainly are, you're not a research expert, but you sure read a lot of studies.
That I have.
So, yeah, that you have. So thank you so much for joining us on All Things Breastfeeding, and we'll talk to you again sometime soon.
You're most welcome, Barbara. Thanks for having me.
If you are enjoying our All Things Breastfeeding podcast, if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast listening device, that would be great. If you have topics or things of interest you'd like us to discuss, please email Barbara at lactalearning.com. And remember, check out our show notes if you want to look at some of the studies we're talking about. So thanks. Thanks for listening.